Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to our first course at Fatih Mehmet Academy. So just a brief rundown of what Fatih Mehmet Academy is. Okay, so Fatih Mehmet Academy was established in Ramadan 1441 AH, which was just a few months ago, May 2020, by myself. And the main reason that I felt the need or the main reason to establish FMA was to really provide content that is really accessible to the Muslim community and that encapsulates a lot of basic essential knowledge services, but as well as quite deep and intricate and relevant dynamic topics that can really be fleshed out in detail over a number of sessions. So it's quite different from, for example, a podcast where it's just 2 hours, 3 hours with a host. Whereas this will really, it's more academic and almost university styled lectures and sessions that will really touch on some deep and relevant topics that people are quite interested in. Inshallah, the aim is to really get people that are thoroughly versed in these topics and are experts in these topics. And of course, the other intention is to make it easily accessible, very affordable, and make it a comfortable learning space, inshallah. So currently, Fatih Mehmet Academy is running how to read Quran classes that's being offered. So there are a couple of classes running, and inshallah the aim after that is to offer free Quran, worldwide Quran classes on a regular basis, so that anyone in the world can access how to read the Quran completely free of charge, and basically a community service for anyone in the world that's interested. Now, what are some planned topics that we plan to hold in the future? So really, some of the planned topics include Islamic and Western thinkers, key Islamic and Western thinkers, and the ambit of their ideas. And we really want to cover a broad range of topics. So as you can see, Islamic and Western philosophy, history, modern, ancient, Islamic history, also the last 100 years, formation of various nation states and how nations formed in the last 100 years, politics, epistemology, ethics and philosophy, sociology, modernity, postmodernity, which kind of overlap, liberalism, economics, critical theory, psychoanalysis, ontology, and more. Okay, so these are quite heavy, full-on topics, and the plan is to really be able to provide a learning space where we can canvas these ideas and topics and provide a productive learning space, inshallah. So the first topic, as you can all see, is that we chose racism as the first topic, as it's been quite relevant since recently the events of George Floyd, but more broadly, it's really something that we should know more about, because it has really shaped the world. It has really shaped the world since the Enlightenment and advent of European colonialism, in really shaping the structures and imbalances between third world and first world, and how the mechanics of all those, all the institutions and nation states and all these interactions, and how these all are posited in the global landscape. So racism is a fundamental feature of all of this. So inshallah, the aim was to make this the first course of Fatih Mehmet Academy, and inshallah there will be a lot more exciting courses to come. All right, just some general information about this course. So it will be held on Saturday for the next 4 weeks on 9:30 a.m. GMT, which is 8:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. The last session will end, inshallah, on the 14th of November. Length per session is given roughly 2 hours minimum, but it might go on for longer if the question and answers go on for a bit longer. So inshallah, 2 hours minimum. And what you'll get access to, recordings of the sessions and copies of PowerPoint slides. Okay, and also if you want to ask further questions, you can engage with the instructor, inshallah. The cost is $7 per hour, which will come down to $14 per session. Okay. Obviously, this session is free, inshallah. Just since it's the first course, we wanted to open it up for the public this first session, inshallah. And the payment details will be sent during the week, inshallah. So if you haven't registered, there's a link that you can click and register, inshallah, which I'll provide later on, inshallah. All right. About the instructor, I think actually Brother Nadeem would be the best person to give more information about himself. So I'll hand over the mic to Brother Nadeem Dawud, and he can get started, inshallah. So I'll start my screen up. Do you want me to keep this screen, Nadeem, or?
Yeah, let's keep that for a second, and then I'll share mine in just a second. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Yeah, so it says there, I've studied history extensively at Oxford and currently at King's College. Attempting to do a PhD. My kind of specific focus on my PhD is partition, culture and politics, and the effect on women. Yeah, my master's, as it says there, my master's was in global history, which is kind of pertinent to racism and this kind of thing, because you're looking at the history of people across the world as a whole, rather than zooming in on a specific culture or a specific individual time period. You're looking at how ideas have intersected, how people have intersected with one another, and so on. So it's quite pertinent, actually, I think, to this. And as it says there, my main research interests are intersection of culture and politics. So how culture influences politics and how politics influences culture. And again, the intersection of that and how that kind of filters out to various stratas of society. Yep, and it says there, at the moment working on a number of decolonial projects, history in specifically, decolonizing some curriculums, so looking at kind of expanding the current curriculums within universities to include more diverse histories, but also more diverse sources of history, right? So we tend to, as historians, look at a very small set of sources, which are epistemologically or ontologically Eurocentric, and we want to try and expand that. And we're currently doing that by actually trying to launch a journal and working with some activists to bring those activists into the academy, not into the academy necessarily, but to bring their expertise and their perspectives into the academy. So that's who I am. So let's get started with the session. So we've got like a decent little class here. So I always prefer that, actually. I always prefer smaller classes to larger ones. It just means that we're a bit more kind of able to have we're a bit more able to have interaction and a bit more discussion rather than me telling you stuff. What I'll do is I'll go through the slides and open up to questions and comments from the class. So as I said, this course, inshallah, will be racism, history, dimensions, and analysis. Today's session is defining racism, so it's going to try and give a baseline on what racism, not necessarily what racism is, but where it came from, and how we've kind of arrived at the tropes and how we've arrived at the way we view races today. Before I get into that, so my contact details, if you guys want to email me further questions or further kind of discussions, that's my email address. You can make a note of that if you like. As I said there, I've not actually assigned any readings. I didn't want to make any readings a prerequisite for this for various reasons. People don't have access to readings. People don't have time to read everything. So I didn't want to restrict anybody from this because of that. But if you do want to do readings around this, drop me an email and I can drop you some literature. We can even, if you guys want, I'm happy to have a discussion chain on email. I think that's always fruitful rather than having the sessions and being like, okay, go away now, I'll see you next week. I think it's fruitful to have a discussion chain on email or any other kind of social media that you guys want around the topics that we've discussed. Okay, so let's get into this. I won't go through that because we've already wasted enough time, but that's just the kind of outline of the course. As I said, today's discussion is about providing a baseline of race and racism, the terms, and how we arrived at where we are today in terms of racism. So, European origins, classical antiquity. So there is I think probably I'm probably going against the grain here in saying that racism is not a modern problem. A lot of race theorists, in particular critical race theorists, define racism as being a modern problem that exists in modernity. And the reason for that is because modernity has structures that enforce racism, right? In my opinion, as a global historian, I always have believed that ideas often exist before practice. So what we find when we look into classical antiquity is a proto-racism. So this is not, to be clear, this is not the racism that we have today as we would understand it and as critical race theorists would understand it, and as we can see being enacted around us in the world. This is proto-racism. So this is, when we look back in ancient classical Greek and classical Roman culture, what we often find is that there was environmental determinism, which is a way of delineating or defining the world according to the environments found within those places, and then ascribing characteristics to the people found them. So what we find is that when we look into classical antiquity, they've divided the world into things like barbarity. So barbarity or barbarism, we might use those terms today, it was a way of describing the uncivilized, was describing the people at the fringes of Greek and Roman civilization, the Gauls, the barbarians in Britain, and so on and so forth. So it's a way of delineating culture and non-culture, civilization and non-civilization, Greek, non-Greek, Roman, non-Roman. And what would happen is this environmental determinism would then often lead to ascribing, as I said, characteristics. So Asians were soft because they lived in warm countries, for example, whereas the Greeks were hard and tough because they lived in a relatively colder climate, which made them more hardier. And these were, to be clear, these were then actually made into inferior and superior characteristics. So it would be this group of people is inferior because they have this set of characteristics, and we are superior because we have this set of characteristics. Now, it's difficult to connect from classical antiquity to today, but the reason I want to go back that far is because I really want to impress that these are ideas that were European origin, firstly, and that have existed for a very, very long time in Europe. And there were thinkers within the modern period. So the example I've given, there's Montesquieu, who was a classical liberal, and he agreed with this environmental determinism. So he was like, cold countries create hard people, soft countries create soft people, and we, being French, are hard people, and we're more suited to democracy and justice and all this sort of stuff, right? We have, as an aside, but an important aside, there were Muslim cartographers and Muslim thinkers like Al-Makdisi, Juwayni, Al-Masudi, who adopted environmental determinism or some form of environmental determinism. And I've only included this point here as a counterpoint or as a way of kind of demonstrating that this classical antiquity, this kind of proto-racism, doesn't always end in modern racism that we have today. So although these Muslim cartographers adopted some form of environmental determinism, so for instance, what you'll find is that in their descriptions, you'll like split Zanj and Habash and Bilad al-Sudan, and they have different characteristics between what otherwise we may view as being a one people or one group of people. But yeah, that didn't end in racism as we view it in kind of the modern world, and definitely not the same form of racism that we view today coming out of Europe predominantly. So just a quick bit of classical antiquity there. So environmental determinism becomes important in the way that Europeans begin to view the world. So they don't necessarily take wholesale Greek and Roman ideas, but they do take enough of it to start to kind of build a worldview and build atlases. So this guy here, Abraham Ortelius, created what was the first atlas of the world. And he did this by taking 53 different maps, reproducing them and putting them together in this book, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Theatre of the World, in 1570, which was published in Antwerp. Now, what's interesting about this? What's interesting about the atlas is that it begins to, and I'll show you a map of it in a second. It begins to split out the world in something that we might recognize today, but it splits it out in these kind of racialized tropes and as racialized people. So on this cover, the 1601 cover, that you can see here on the right hand side, what we have is we have four types of people. So Europe's at the top here, and Europe is the queen. So Europe is the atlas. Actually, he goes through the atlas by using Europe as a way to introduce each map or each kind of people. So Europe is the queen that rules over all other people. You can see like the scepter and the throne and this kind of stuff, and like really civilized and quite a long way excuse me, quite a long way above the other people, like undisputed queen. On the right-hand side here, we have what we may consider to be a slightly civilized culture, definitely less civilized than the Europeans, but they have like, they're fairly peaceful. They have this kind of flower and like a bit of clothing, still a little bit naked. And these are what in the modern period would have been considered the red races. So generally speaking, they would have been Americans, Native Americans. It's difficult to kind of transpose, I suppose, the indigenous people of other nations. So Aborigines, for instance, or people of Pacific Islanders. It really seems to be that these guys were not necessarily aware of them, or they had classified Aborigines and Pacific Islanders as black rather than red or indigenous. At the bottom here, I mean, that's really clearly uncivilized black people. You can see that this lady is holding a head there, so they're cannibalistic. There's a person that, there's a bit of a fire there going on. They're cooking this person. They're hunters predominantly by kind of this administration. And really kind of uncivilized, base level civilization. And then when we look at it on the left here is Asian cultures, which are sensual, right? Very kind of like sensually dressed. I don't know how else to describe that really. And we have her holding this bit of kind of incense, or whatever, what it might be, to really kind of highlight that these people are really civilized, but they're sensual. They're not like Europeans. They're not driven by logic and reason. So this is in the 16th century, how the Europeans are now splitting out the world. I'll stop there for any questions or comments. Okay. So this is a reproduction of one of the maps in Ortelius's atlas. It's in. I mean, any comments on this? Anyone, like, do you guys notice anything about this? I don't know if you guys could read it actually. So on this map, again, we have this kind of like cardinal way of splitting out the world. So on the left here, we have Occident, the Western world. On the right here, we have Orient, the Eastern world. And then we have the North and South. So we have Septentrio, which is of the North. It comes from Latin for of the North. And then at the bottom here, we have Terra Australis non cognita. So this actually has nothing to do with Australia. It was a hypothetical continent called Terra Australis. Australis being the Latin for of the South. Australia comes from the Latin for of the South. Australia, I think, is the feminine nominative from the Latin Australis. But you have, for instance, descriptions here like India. Can you guys see my cursor, by the way? Because I can't actually see it on my screen, but I'm trying to point. Can you guys see my cursor where I'm pointing to?
Yep, visible.
Cool, brilliant. So we have, for instance, India Orientalis. So India, kind of the East. And of course, later on, this is used to kind of entrench these Orientalist notions within the Western world, and to depict this Oriental idea of India and other countries of the East within racialized discourse. You have here, for instance, Barbaria. So it's actually split into like Barbaria. For what's interesting about this is it was for a very, very long time, it was the boundary of civilization between Christendom and Muslims. So when you had caliphate extending that far, this was kind of like especially in American discourses, in American fiction, there was a genre of fiction where it was like white slave narratives. They were often fictionalized, although there was some truth to them in some cases, but they were often fictionalized. And what would happen is, they would be like, I went traveling on a ship one day and we got marooned off the coast of Morocco and I became a slave and blah, blah, and so on and so forth. So these aren't just, this is the point, these aren't just labels. These aren't just like labels of, this is called this. This is called this. These are these people, type of people that live there, and you create this narrative around them. So this narrative of white slavery in America comes from this kind of meeting of civilizations between America and the Muslims. What's also interesting actually is that although they called it barbaric and Barbria and Berber, is where we also derive that term from. Barbarossa is also from that term. What's often also the case within these narratives is that these people will be like, actually, we also recognize the power of the Muslims, like not in like a kind of like harking back to glory type thing. It's like, yeah, we recognize that outside of Christendom, there is another civilization, another powerful civilization, who are the Muslims, and this is where we kind of meet. Yes, you can see that these type of labels are used on this map very early on, but we still use today. We still use, we still use these terms 500 years later. Oriental, barbaric, and so on and so forth. And you can see, so we spoke about environmental determinism a little bit earlier on. You can see here that we have these circus Arcticus, the Arctic Circle, tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, and the equator. So tropicus, by the way, actually comes from the same root as trope, and it means to turn. And the way that the Greeks had set out the world was kind of very similar to this. So they were like, this region, this area here has this type of weather and this type of people. And the same thing with this bit. This part has this type of weather and therefore this type of people. And same here and same here. And you can kind of see those tropes about the world still today. They live in this type of environment, and therefore they're like this. So these tropes are enduring. But I really want to kind of impress that. So when I came to label this course, and I labeled it racisms rather than racism, it's because, and again, I may be going against the grain here of race theory, in general, kind of like what's accepted. But in my opinion, racism is not one thing; it's multiple things, right? But they produce a zeitgeist, they produce a culture which is in itself racist. So when I say European origins, what I really want to impress on you guys is that this kind of discourse is exclusively European in its origin, and is so deeply entrenched in European culture, right? It's not one thing; it's multiple things of this culture, right? Almost every single part of European culture that we can think of, we can trace some sort of trope back into it, right? Which is why I label it racism rather than racism, if that kind of makes sense. Again, I'll open up to any comments or questions.
Yeah, just an observation regarding that map. When was that map produced?
Let me go back to it. So this was in, so the original was 1570.
Okay.
This particular version, I chose it for its the clarity of it. It's one of the clearer ones I could find, but this is definitely a copy of Ortelius's, one of his original maps. It's not like it's not one of his maps. It's one of his maps, but I only chose this image particularly because it's clear. There are other copies where you have, like in the corners, you have different poems by Cicero or other Latin poets and this sort of thing. They were decorated and in that kind of style.
Yeah, so my observation was that I actually came across a real life to scale map of the world recently, and apparently Africa is actually a lot larger than that's currently on all the standard maps in the world. Africa is actually much larger, and
yeah,
I'm not sure why that. Why that might be.
Yeah, so a lot of these maps. So it's interesting anecdote for you guys, since it's October and we've just had Columbus Day. So a lot of these maps are actually relying on Ptolemy's map, well, his coordinates actually. He didn't actually draw a map. He had coordinates where he kind of estimated the size of the world. And so later maps, including later maps that were kind of made by the Muslims, were reliant on his coordinates. They updated some of them at times and updated the estimates of how big the world was, because Ptolemy was off by about 10,000 kilometers. So what happened was, because of that, maps got kind of compressed, right? And Ptolemy was drawing, he kind of estimated this it would have been around some point between 100 BC and 100 AD. He was alive at some point during that time, and I can't exactly remember the date, but it was very, very early on, right? 2,000 years ago plus. And we're still relying on those kind of calculations. So things got kind of compressed. So when Columbus and Magellan set off on their voyage from Europe to find the East, they relied on Ptolemy's map. And because it was compressed and smaller by about 10,000 kilometers, they very, very naturally thought it would be quicker to go west to get to the East. Otherwise, what would happen is they would have to go from here around Africa to the East, which was in their calculations longer. So there's that reason. There's also the obvious reason of racism, where because these were European maps, they wanted to kind of show Europe as being bigger than Africa and other countries. They want to center Europe, so therefore they made them smaller. There's also the other reason of, within cartography, it's difficult to show the world 2D when actually it is kind of 3D. A lot of these maps have a lot of problems. When you can see from here, the way that they split up the world and labeled certain things and done certain things, it's centering a European idea, European conceptions of what the rest of the world was like. Therefore it naturally follows that they would want to make other countries kind of smaller or more compressed or whatever it may be. But there's no simple answer. Is also true. Any other questions or comments on that currently?
Yeah, just on the Ortelius map and in terms of the front cover, which you went through about the different placement of obviously different peoples. In terms of Africans at the bottom, in terms of being uncivilized and cannibalistic, where was that initial perception built from?
So there was a lot of that going on within kind of Greek and Roman discourse. So the Greeks described Ethiopia is a Greek word. meaning burnt face, coming from ethi and opus for face. Now they had like a number of different kind of ways of describing Africans. Ironically, it's actually quite like an axis, if you think of it that way, rather than pole. So they, on the one hand, would say that Africans were godly people because they were at the equator. It meant they were closer to God, right? Which I could never reconcile, because they also thought that the gods lived on Mount Olympus. But anyway, but they also had the opposite kind of idea that Africans were, you know, they weren't Greek, they were other, and they were kind of backwards and cannibalistic and ate each other. And that endured into modernity, where, you know, you have descriptions of Africans from people who had never met Africans. So there's one description I read of Africans where the guy was like, I met 2 African people in Danzig. And from there, he extrapolated that because of the shape of their face and the skulls and blah, blah, you know, they eat people. It's kind of like as blasé for these Europeans as that. It's because of the shape of your skull, because of this, because you don't have writing and blah, blah, you must be backwards. On the other hand, you also have reports from, you know, people like Columbus and Magellan and, you know, John Cook and so on, who, when they met natives in their native lands, who very rightfully were defending themselves and trying to drive them out, and greeted them, you know, in European with hostility, reported back that, you know, these people were, you know, how dare they not accept us Europeans as their saviors, and how dare they not, you know, front us with open arms and blah, blah, blah. And therefore they must be people who eat people. You know, and that is not to say, by the way, that there aren't tribes who weren't cannibalistic and who aren't still cannibalistic. There were, but I mean, this kind of trope that all of these tribes and all of these people and all of these, you know, it just got extrapolated from all these different descriptions. Yeah. But we'll go more into that in a little bit, actually. Any other questions on that or comments? Okay, so if race was the answer, what was the question? Again, my perspective is slightly different from race theorists, and that's not, by the way, I'm not, I know I keep saying this, but that's not to say that people who are engaged in critical race theory and race theorists are, you know, it's complementary work, basically. It's not less or it's not wrong, it's complementary. So if race was the answer, what was the question? So racism basically tried to answer the question of where man came from and what was the white European's place in the world. And you have, broadly speaking, different approaches in trying to answer this, the religious and the scientific. So it's not like it's, you know, again, like a thing that just exists self-contained in itself. Race is very fundamental to how Europeans understood the world, right? It's not like it was just systemized and kind of like put together incidentally. It's very, very core to how Europeans understand the world. And this is important to understand because, it persists to this day. You know, you can extrapolate that out into culture, how Europeans view European culture versus other cultures, how Europeans create knowledge versus how everybody else creates knowledge, and so on and so forth, right? And it stems from this. It stems from answering this very fundamental question of where the hell do we come from and what's our place in the world versus over against everyone else. So let's quickly go to religious racism. So this is an interesting quote from Colin Kidd, whose book is brilliant on this subject, where he says the central issue was not so much one's possession of a particular color of skin as one's membership of a particular lineage, singled out in the Old Testament for special favor or disfavor. So people tend to believe or think that race is only to do with skin color, right? Which is why you can get people who, people who are like, reverse racism exists, right? Because they think it's only to do with skin color. That's not the case. Skin color is probably the least of the considerations within race. It's everything else that goes into kind of thinking about how race is constructed, how people are, right? And how they are essentialized. And in this case, with religious racism, it's, do we actually even in fact share the same ancestors, and do we share the same lineage? And what does that say about you if we don't? And then religious racism also used nations as set out in the Old Testament. So we saw the map previously. They also extrapolated not only environmental determinism, but also how the Old Testament sets out nations and describes them to map out the world and to map out people and to map out the progenitors of race and of the progenitors of those people. So the mark of Cain, for instance, was blackness. And let's go into that a little bit more. So these graphics, I've got a couple of graphics here. So these are Noah's sons, right? So as I said, let's go back a slide. So Noah's sons became the progenitors of race in kind of religious discourse on race. Noah, or Nuh alayhi salam, and his descendants became the progenitors of race. Excuse me. So he had three sons, Japhet, Hamet, and Shem. And so this graphic kind of like describes quite nicely. I mean, I don't actually think it's very accurate, if I'm going to be honest, for various reasons, which I won't get into, but it shows you the level of kind of thinking around where people settled and where they came from, and what that meant for them, right? So I don't think actually, like much of this is actually that accurate, but it gives you an idea of how complex this or complicated these ideas, well, this lineage became. So Japhet, that's his lineage. Shem, that's his lineage, and then lastly we have Ham, his lineage. So what happens is that theologically speaking, the church has now a way of defining otherness, right? So when we come back to that question about who we are and where we came from, there was a question around, well, if in the Bible it says man is made in the image of God, and Adam and Eve were the first people, how do we have all these other people? How do we have all these other races, right? Were Adam and Eve white? And the church's answer to that was, well, of course they were white, because we're white, and of course they were white because whiteness is, the top people, the top race. So they had to figure out a way of, being theologically sound, while also figuring out where everyone else came from. So this is what they settled on. They settled on, okay, that makes sense. What happened is there was a flood, and after that, the earth was repopulated. Noah had three sons. Therefore, there are three racialized groups, broadly speaking, that came from that. What's important is that Japhet and Ham were pagan, right? So actually, let me pause there a second and come back to something else. So this is a bit different from racism as we understand it today. this is to do with lineage, right? So this is to do with like descendants of a person and their features and so on and so forth, right? Rather than racialized groups of otherness, which we'll come on to in a bit. So they're not othered scientifically; they're othered through lineage, through their people that that were their progenitors. And so the descendants of Japheth and Ham were pagan. So the lineage was pagan. So therefore, because they were not Christian, you could do what you wanted to them, right? You could go and civilize them. You could go and enslave them and so on and so forth. The descendants of Shem were monotheists, and that meant Jewish or Christian, not necessarily Muslim, right? It was almost exclusively Jewish or Christian. And this is where we get the terms that we still use today: Semitic people, Hamitic people. Japhetic isn't used anymore. It was used up until the 19th century to describe Europeans. It's after that no longer used. It's just another way of removing yourself as Europeans from this discourse around race. Because as Europeans, we're not a race. We're Europeans. We're people. We are like, we can't be describing ourselves as a race. That's ungodly. That's that's unbecoming of who we are. Everybody else is a race. So you don't describe yourself as a race. You describe everyone else as a race. And then you have this kind of term ethnic. So, which you guys will recognize. And ethnic was with the K. You won't believe how much trouble I had trying to put that K in there. Like PowerPoint kept correcting it. I just refused to accept that spelling. But it first kind of comes around in the probably earlier than 1656. It's probably used in the late 16th, early 17th century. But one of the first places actually defined in any way is in Thomas Blount's Glossographia. Thomas Blount was a lexicographer. That Glossographia is actually still used today to teach language and definitions of words. But it was this term ethnic was first used then as to mean someone who's a heathen or ungodly. So again, everyone else is ethnic. You're ethnic. This group, right? When we unpack it, everybody else is ethnic. Everybody else is exotic. Everybody else is X. We are, center of the universe, and everything extends out from us. So that's how religious racism starts to define otherness and other people. And it also starts to describe criminality and define criminality, right? So the mark of Cain was blackness. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with your biblical, you almost definitely are familiar with the story of Habil and Qabil, who he murdered his brother. Cain murdered his brother Abel because of some jealousy, and he was cursed. And so in this theory of monogenesis, i.e. single origin of Adam and Eve, this was another way of describing blackness. And again, it probably wasn't a physical, actually blackness. It was like to do with evil and criminality and that sort of thing. So in the biblical story, Cain murders Abel, and he is therefore thereafter marked with blackness, and his descendants are marked with blackness and criminality. Right? The curse of Ham, this was a different theory, or depending on how you look at it, a complementary theory. So the curse of Ham was also blackness, and Ham, this might be a story that you're less familiar with, was again one of the sons of Noah. And in the Bible, the story goes that Noah became a wine farmer. He planted all these grapes, he made all this wine, and one day he drank all the wine and got really drunk and went and slept in his tent. And Ham came and saw Noah naked in his tent. Then he went out and told his two brothers, Dad's naked in this tent. And his two brothers, then the story goes in the Bible, they turned their backs, they turned around, draped the cloth over their shoulders, two of them, walked in backwards and put the cloth over Noah's naked body. Noah, hearing what Ham had done, i.e., gone and like snitched on him, basically cursed Ham and his progeny to be the servants of the servants, the lowest of the low type thing. So this was a way of Christianity, on the one hand, associating blackness and criminality, so saying that black people are all descendants of Ham and therefore they're all criminals, and also, on the other hand, well, not that hand, it's putting the same hand actually, also justifying slavery. So this is how they justify slavery, theologically. In contrast, white man was completely free of criminality and original sin because of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. So white man was, he was sinless. White man specifically, because original sin was a burden that women carried, right? So white man was completely like free of sin, was sinless, couldn't do any sin, whereas anybody non-white and anybody female, they were sinful and had to be controlled by white men. So this is the verse from the Bible. Cursed be Canaan. Canaan is the descendant of Ham. A servant of servants, he shall be to his brethren. So this is the religious justification. This is the religious kind of like framing of race and racism. I'll stop there for any comments or questions on that in particular, on religious racism. Well,
yes. How does Islam bypass this racism that's predominantly from a Christianity? Predominantly from Christianity.
Well, classically, I guess in medieval Islam, it's, you have the notion that all tribes are made to recognize one another. So we don't actually have a hierarchy or othering of tribes. In the root, right, in the Quran and Sunnah, we don't have this. We don't have a justification for treating anybody as a race and differently. What we do have, obviously, is justification of piety and non-piety, like taqwa, whatever, right? Now that in itself can be distorted and has been distorted and used to otherize people in many ways. But in terms of this kind of like thing about, all man is, European man is from Adam and Eve and everyone else is from other people and they're criminal. I mean, I've not come across anything like that in Islamic scriptures where we say, because there's single Genesis, i.e. Adam and Eve, how do we explain everyone else? It's not like, I don't think we have that problem theologically. I don't think we've ever had that problem theologically, because I don't think as Muslim civilization, we've ever placed ourselves in that position to say, we're the center of the world and the universe. There may be individual cases. I'm not denying that there was racism within Islamic history, or a type of racism in Islamic history, but certainly this particular problem of racializing lineage, racializing other people, I don't think we've ever really had that theologically, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So would you say that Christianity is fundamentally racist from its sources?
Well, that's an interesting question because, it's Christianity, I think, means so many different things to many different people. And as we kind of know, it's not always the case that it's been kind of preserved in any particular way. European Christianity, definitely, I would say that European Christianity has a race problem.
Like even Jesus, he was Jewish, right? He was probably like quite dark skinned, but the way he's portrayed is his white, almost very white.
Yeah, exactly. Because of this, because it's not an aesthetic reason. So often you find people saying that Jesus is white because of aesthetic reasons, and it's familiarity with culture, and it's to do with familiarity or whatever, right? It's racialized, right? If the fact is, if Jesus isn't white, how does white man absolve himself of sin? He can't, right? He can't. Within this theological construct, he cannot absolve himself of sin. He is sinful. Whereas when you make Jesus white, and you say Jesus was white European from, and particularly from the lineage of Shem, that's how they get around this idea of him being Palestinian and or Hebrew, whatever. It's that lineage. So he has to be white. There's no choice but for the church but to portray him as white. So theologically, European man can absolve himself of sin, and everybody else is sinful, right? So it's like that. Whereas obviously we don't have the problem. We don't have the problem of we don't have that problem of absolving ourselves of sin, because we're all sinful as Muslims, all right? We all know that. That's why we make istighfar and so on. We don't have that problem per se. Any other comments or questions on that?
Just wanted to ask in relation to, you've had certain perceptions such as like Darwin and Francis Galton, the whole discussion about the Irish being placed within hierarchies right at the bottom of the low, even lower than the Africans. Just wanted to ask in terms of the interracial dynamics within Europe, that doesn't necessarily seem to be hinged upon a theological premise. And where really the interracial racism stem from?
I'll come on to that in a little bit. Actually, in terms of scientific racism, but even within the theological construct, so don't misunderstand that scientific and religious racism were separate. They often overlapped, as we'll see. So we'll come onto the Irish question in just a little bit, but suffice to say that actually the way they got around that was to say the Irish were originally African, is how they got around that. And it comes back into environmental determinism. So they believed that because white man was the original man, that if you were to give Africans or non-white groups the right environmental conditions, they would revert back to whiteness. Which again is why they're able to justify a civilizing mission, is the word I'm looking for. But I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in just a second, actually. Particularly the Irish question. Any other points? Counterpoints? Okay. So let's get on to scientific racism. So scientific racism is actually probably more well known about, I think. I think most people would have come across some of these ideas, at least in to some extent. And what you have here is so Georges Cuvier. He's an interesting guy because he's a polygenicist. He believes in multiple origins of man. So generally speaking, the French are polygenicists and the English are monogenicists. You also have polygenesis cultures like the Japanese and the Chinese, who believed in that they were of one origin and everyone else was of a different origin. But Georges Cuvier was a French guy who was like, no, we don't have the same, like, that's ungodly to think that we would have the same origin as criminal black types, right? That's ungodly to think that. But he also believed if the right representative specimen was chosen, then the essential of the category could be understood. So what scientific racism is about, as opposed to spiritual or sort of religious racism, is essentializing, right? Is about essentializing individuals and essentializing groups to say that you have these essential characteristics. Whereas religious racism is about lineage. It's about because you come from Ham or you come from Cain, you are criminal. So there's a slight difference there. Slight difference. So scientific racism took off really in the 19th centuries, whereas religious racism predates that as early as kind of 16th century. And I started with Carl Linnaeus, and I think generally a lot of people do start with Carl Linnaeus when they're talking about scientific racism, although he was not necessarily kind of like, these weren't his, he wasn't a pioneer in these ideas. He kind of like just expanded them further. He took a lot of these ideas and was like, he was like, let me kind of like delve into these a bit more deeply, classify them, whereas some of these ideas existed previously. So there were thinkers who were like not necessarily essentializing races, but were like putting them in hierarchies of beauty. So there were, white man is more beautiful than the Asian man, then red, and then black. So it started off with that kind of nature. And again, I think you can probably see some of the themes existing today to do with beauty and beauty standards. And really, the origins are this far back. But Carl Linnaeus takes those ideas and really expands on them, really expands on them. He's also a botanist. He actually primarily was a botanist. So this idea that you could classify everything and anything kind of stems from this European culture of trying to figure out logical groupings rather than genealogical groupings. So, literally these guys were like, oh, well, this thing looks similar to this thing, therefore it must be related, right? Whereas taxonomy now actually is slightly different. It's now more genealogical. But Carl Linnaeus was like, okay, well, humans kind of look similar, but obviously we're not similar, we're different. This is a given truth at the time. So he begins to classify humans in that way. So Homo ferus was a slightly separate category to Homo sapien. And this is kind of how far these categories went. It wasn't enough to basically say that these are different types of humans. What they did was say that these are different species of human, right? And at this time, race and species was used interchangeably. So it was, you could speak about race and actually mean species, and you could speak about species and actually mean race. And I think there are still some connotations today of that. Excuse me. I think there are some connotations today of that that exist. When we talk about other people, it's almost like we're talking about a different species of people. But so he classified humans in this way. So Homo ferus, wild, savage, cool man. So he wasn't Homo sapien, human like Carl Linnaeus is human. He was ferus. He was wild, savage, less developed. Europaeus albus, who is ingenious, white, sanguine, governed by law. Now, what you'll notice there, if you speak Latin, if you don't, I'll translate. It's Europaeus. So European, albus is white. So albus is the Latin term for white. So he's not just describing people's essential characteristics. He's describing where you originate from and your color. Right, so it takes both of those things in Carl Linnaeus's taxonomy to be ingenious white sandals governed by law, right? You have to be European white. It's not enough for you to be white or to be found in Europe, which is partly answers the Irish question, but we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail. Although Irish Albus were white, they weren't European, if that makes sense. Then you have Americanus rubescus, red American. So happy with this lot, liberty-loving, tanned and irascible, governed by custom. So again, it's interesting that Native Americans are kind of like their own category as an indigenous group, rather than indigeneity being the grouping by itself, which of course it shouldn't be, but it's interesting that that's the case here in this kind of scientific racism. Asiaticus luridus for the Latin from yellow. Who's melancholy, governed by opinion, and Asa Niger, crazy, lazy, careless, black, governed by the arbitrary will of the master. This is from his work, Systema Naturae. These weren't by any means kind of like agreed upon classifications, by the way. So there were other scientific racial theorists, if you like, who had similar groupings. Some had 5. So Homo ferus is not really included. Some had 5, where they included Malay as a separate category to Asians, and some had the 4, but labeled them slightly different. Now this is like, it's a view of human beings. It's a view of humanity as animals, right? Because this is how you classify animals. In Latin, you have vulpus for fox, for instance, right? Or equus caballus for horse. And the same way, they're transposing that kind of like category of animals to human beings as animals. And therefore, you're able to classify them and split them out and give them essential characteristics, much like an animal has essential characteristics. Now, what's interesting about Carl Linnaeus, although these ideas kind of predate him, what's interesting is he not only does he classify human beings in this way, he has Homo ferus as a category, but he also has Homo simians as a category, simia, meaning like higher primate kind of thing, right? So what happens to poor old Carl is that he publishes his work. People are like, well, this is blasphemous, because you can't call us animals, you can't call us primates, we're the people made in the image of God. So how can you call us animals? That's really naughty of you, Carl. So he's like, no, hold on, it's fine, because actually there's a simian category that you didn't know about. And these are the simian races, which include some African races, which are importantly simian negroids. So he splits out again, not just like you're a different human being, you're a completely different species to me, right? You're a completely different species. You're not like human at all, as I am human. Obviously, as you can see there, he still maintains his Homo sapien categories there also, but then he splits out simian categories. Then you get this guy, Johann Blumenbach. So I'm not going to go through like all the different thinkers that existed. I'm going to go through some of the main ones that are like really contributed to the scientific racism thought. By the way, any points or questions on Linnaeus or Carl Linnaeus or anything like that at the moment? Okay, so this guy, Blumenbach, was slightly, he didn't really believe that Linnaeus was complicated or complex enough. He was like, this is not, you're not really like, it needs to be more complex, it needs to be more exact. Because what you're doing is you're grouping things logically. So you're saying, for instance, because this thing looks like this thing, therefore it must be the same. Whereas Blumenbach was like, no, that can't be the case. We have to look and analyze at the genealogical level and kind of like determine things a bit more scientifically. Excuse me. So yeah, so he started this trend of analyzing skull shapes to determine racial characteristics. So literally, like, he would measure the cranium and look at skulls and look at the cavity and the sinuses and the teeth and this kind of thing, and determine somehow characteristics from those measurements and ratios and whatever have you. He still believed, despite his need or want for exactness, he still believed that European man was more handsome because of the shape of his skull. Or rather, because of the shape of his skull, European man was more handsome. He just had, like, the angle was correct. Like, he literally came down to that. He measured the angle of the face and was like, that's a nice angle. I like that angle. Whereas, the angle of Africans was a bit different. He's like, that's a bad angle. His classification included slightly different categories, including Caucasian, Mongolians, Ethiopians, Americans, and Malays. So he's a bit more exact. Caucasians is an interesting one, because Caucasians is, and this is again the overlap of scientific and religious racisms. Caucasians comes from this belief that Noah's Ark landed, that's the term, or ended up in the Caucasus Mountains. And then man originated from there. So original white man was Caucasian because he was the original kind of person from the Caucasus. So you can see the overlap between the two. Caucasian is not a scientific or a purely scientific category; it's a religious category also. Any questions at the moment on that? Okay, this is some of his figures of the different skulls. Don't ask me to read that because I can't. It's too. I couldn't find a clearer version, I'm afraid. But this is sort of thing that he was doing, like drawing these things. I want you to pay close attention to this because we'll revisit these caricatures in a little while. And then we have scientific racism from Buffon, who was kind of in the same kind of like mode of thought as Blumenbach, who kind of believed in Linnaeus not being exact enough. He also believed in environmental determinism. So remember that thing I was saying about if you were to take Black people and Asian people and put them in European environments, they would become European. I believe that white race was a race. And again, creates a genealogical classification, not a logical one. Much like, so he's kind of more in the same school of thought as Blumenbach, as opposed to Linnaeus. So these three guys, and then you had Darwin a bit later on, kind of really advanced scientific racism. It's coming up to 10 to 12. Can we take a quick 5-minute comfort break to refill my water and get a tissue? A little bit of a cold. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Can we do that and we'll come back? Should we say 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Right. For everyone else to get back. Any other questions or comments at this point, by the way? Well, am I boring you guys that much?
No, no, it's very interesting. It's going well.
You want to sleep?
No, no.
Okay. Let's carry on then. Is my screen up? I'm sharing, right? I'm still sharing. Okay, good. Yeah, you have these kind of two schools, right, of religious and scientific, and sometimes complemented and overlapped quite a bit in cases. But I hope you guys can see kind of there are themes which exist today in racist tropes and where they're coming from, right? So things like criminality and blackness being associated, where has that come from? Things like, non-whites as another species, or as a lesser species, or lesser people, where has that come from? How we view the world today, I mean, literally, we're still using the same maps and same kind of like way of understanding where things are spatially as we did 2,000 years ago. So just how kind of like core this all is to the kind of culture, society, politics, science, that we understand as being kind of benign, but today, right? I mean, we tend to think of these things as being, I don't know, not necessarily self-contained, but we tend to think of these things as being unaffected by bias or, that sort of stuff. But it's, the underlying suppositions and presumptions are so ingrained. And this is a challenge of racism. This is a challenge of understanding and combating racism. It's, if it was the case that you could say that's racist and mean a kind of a specific thing within a grander, let's take science for example. If we could separate out a thing, right, in science, say that's racist, and do away with it, that would be amazing. That would be great. That would be so easy. We can identify and discard it. But when your whole worldview of science, and science in itself, is built on these assumptions and suppositions and so on, it becomes a lot more difficult to do that. Okay, so same thing with religion. Just give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to plug in my charger. Technical difficulties. Right. Okay, let's go to the Irish question. That's a really interesting question. And the reason it's a really interesting question is because it, sorry, that's my thumb there that you're seeing. The reason it's an interesting question is because people tend to really believe that race is all about color, that it's just color. It's it's not that. If it was that simple, then we wouldn't really be in the mess that we're in. Where's my cursor gone? I've taken it, haven't I? Sorry, bear with me. Cool. Okay. Yes, I think that's fine now. Okay. So yes, so I couldn't find a clearer version of this slide, but you can see there on the left-hand side here, Irish Iberian. This guy's Irish Iberian. And on the right-hand side, we have Negro. And then here we have this guy, Anglo-Teutonic. So this is an example of racialized discourse basically not being about color. It's about the essential characteristics of people who are Irish, and how they were painted as a, or viewed as a simian race. Simian being primate, non-human or other than human, and as you can see there, and it's in the kind of the same way as the Negro race, right, which is also in this conception viewed as being closer to primate. Even, funnily enough, even when the classification is that black races are under the family of human, they are still considered to be more primate than they are human. So, I mean, literally considered that. Like, do you guys remember if you might have done biology, this thing, kingdom, phylum, order, what's that? KP, crisps, offer, family, goodness. So yeah, all that sort of stuff, right? And they literally broke it down into that kingdom, order, family, etc., and black races were often put into similar kind of categories as primates, other primates, and same with Irish. Were put into similar categories as primates, whereas European white man was by himself as a human being. And they were essentialized they were essentialized to have a certain amount of characteristics, right? So Irish people were, because they were simian, because they were related more closely to the Negro, or they came from the Negro. So Iberian basically is a label, meaning, well, from the Iberian Peninsula, but the theory went that they came from Africa, right? They migrated from Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, and then ultimately found themselves in Ireland. Now, let's step back a second, actually, and think about what we were discussing about classical antiquity and how that affects this, right? So we're talking about centuries ago, but when the Romans came into what now is Britain, and kind of fought the indigenous population here, where did they go? To Ireland and Scotland, and into Wales. Some of them went to Wales, right? So what we're seeing here is really this whole idea of environmental determinism, from not necessarily environmental determinism, but some sort of it, from extending from classical antiquity, whereby the Romans were this conquering civilized race coming into Britain. The natives fled, right? And that's how they migrated. They were the barbarians at the time. They were, uncivilized, the other, and that endured, obviously, into even to the modern day, as we'll see in a second, where the Irish again are not considered to be fully white, right, or even white at all, right? It's interesting. So this is again another caricature of the centralized tropes to do with the Irish.
So we have on the left there the Ulster Catholics, right there the Ulster Protestants. So there is an element of this religious racism, that although they have adopted the religion of Christianity, they are still nonetheless apes, simian, uncivilized, and they would kill each other were it not for civilized Britain and black men, who is preventing them from killing each other or knocking each other's senses, as they're insensible. So
you know, again, it's kind of like these things kind of rehab civilize people because they all disarm each other. But we can harm them. I mean, that's a, you know, that guy's, you know, weakness and all, you know, who did awful things in Ireland, absolutely awful things. So we, as white Europeans, can harm other races, but they must not harm themselves or each other. When we do it, it's okay. Then you have here, you know, the quintessential English rose or English bell, whatever, Florence Nightingale on the left. And we have this caricature of Bridget Bruiser on the right there, who is, you know, look, I don't describe the differences to you, do I really? You can see those for yourself. You know, it's you know, you're really kind of like here differentiating and othering, and these would have been used as kind of caricature, this kind of like, you know, picture. In places like newspapers, especially in America, when the Irish were coming over. So America obviously having the lineage back to the Brits, back to British, kind of like, you know, European man. When they had these Irish people come over, they and these kind of like racialized adverts or cartoons, caricatures in newspapers, differentiating this way. And Bridget McBruiser was an American caricature. What's interesting about this is racism originally. So remember what I was saying about the classifications of European.
Sorry, Nadeem, you're cutting out a bit. Your audio is cutting out.
Oh, really? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is it still a bit quiet, or?
No, that's better.
Is that okay? I'll speak a bit louder.
Yeah.
So, what I was saying about those classifications, right? There was an essay printed a little bit before the Linnaeus, and it was printed in this French Southern culture. And what had happened was what was happening was that they were comparing women. They were actually comparing women. They focused heavily on the appearances, features of different races of women. That's actually where some of this stuff started from. And then Linnaeus and these guys kind of built on it. So they were comparing these features, which is
Yeah, you're still cutting out, Nadeem. Still can't hear you properly.
I don't know what's going on.
It's fine. I think it's fine when you're not using the headphones.
When I'm not using headphones.
Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay, maybe let's turn off. So what I was saying was that this kind of characteristic started from French salon culture, the French beauty culture, where they were comparing the features and characteristics of different races of women. So this caricature of Florence Nightingale, which is especially kind of pertinent to racism.
Can you lean forward, Nadeem? Can you lean forward? Because when you're leaning forward, sure. It seems a bit clearer. I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, I think maybe my headphones battery ran out or something. Yeah, so it was it because that actually makes this character all the more pertinent to racism, because it's actually harkening back in a way, probably unintentionally, harkening back in a way to that kind of French salon culture where they were kind of comparing the beauty of different races of women. So the Irish hair is obviously ugly, simian, undesirable, whereas Florence Nightingale is, you know, the picture of beauty. Okay, so this guy here, I'll read out the caption in case you can't read it. So it says, as we dared to call the monkeys in the zoo by Irish names, Erin's son, Erin Rough, declare us not monkeys and demand that we withdraw them, nor should we ignore the claim, for it's really very hard to find the monkey. So you can see that this trope of black people being monkeys was extended to the Irish, who were seen as monkeys, therefore also black. That kind of like trope of blackness being also being associated with animalistic traits, with traits that were underdeveloped and under-evolved, also are true of the Irish. Now, I also want to think back to where these caricatures came from. Not only was it the classifications, it was also those skull images that you saw of Blumenbach, who drew these skulls and compared the African skull and the African shapes of the face and nose and so on to the shapes of the skulls of monkeys and other primates. As you can see here, there is a caricature of an African woman, a black woman. What do you say? What do you say about that? Notice that these again kind of like this thing is not isolated. It's not like there was a group of racists or some racist cartoonists. There was racism that was deeply ingrained in scientific, religious, and cultural contexts. So this has come out of that. You could draw this kind of caricature. You could draw this kind of caricature because science said that this was true. Science said Africans were monkeys, Irish were monkeys, black people were monkeys, and and so on. Again, kind of like contemporary racism here. Apartheid 08, the monkey, right? We have this more more recent caricature of Serena Williams. The guy there is saying he was let her win, and she's very clearly caricatured there. The big lips and the frizzy hair and so on and so forth. I mean, if you look at kind of the way that hair is there, if you go back to the previous slide, the hair there, it's all kind of like, it's very similar, very similar style, big lips and so on. As you can see, very similar style. And she's obviously thrown into it because she can't win, she doesn't win. And she's, she's unreasonable. And yeah, the white lady there is more reasonable. Like, just let her win. It's okay. So that all is to say that racism boils down to these definitions. Racism rationalizes differences between people. Racism, what it does is it says we can see differences. There are differences in color, in there are differences in color, differences in skull shape, in temperament, and so on and so forth. And it rationalizes those differences, tries to explain them. And say that racism is these two things. It rationalizes differences between people. It views these differences and says there are differences in skin color, temperament, skull shape, and so on and so forth. And it tries to explain those differences. It rationalizes them, right? And in some cases, actually rationalizes in a pretty awful way. In more cases, actually, I said that. And then it creates a system based on those differences. So today we've discussed the first element of that, some of the origins of where racism came from or how it rationalizes. And in the following sessions, we'll look at those systems that were based to make difference. I want to leave this last 10, 20 minutes for questions or comments. There was an interesting question at the other day. I don't know if the brother is here. I asked a question about this, which was about Asabiyya and racism and what the difference is, right? So some people have this thinking that Asabiyya is racism, right? Or is a type of racism. Now, I think that's mistaken. I think that's very, very badly mistaken, in all honesty, right? Because it doesn't actually take into account, Asabiyya doesn't take into account, the scholars who make this claim, or people make this claim, do not take into account the environment in which Asabiyya was operating, or the relationships that occurred that we would view as Asabiyya. And frankly, it's kind of lazy analysis, it's pretty lazy analysis. When we look at Asabiyya, when we look at the time of Rasulullah, what we notice is that what is labeled Asabiyya was often inter and intra-tribal dynamics, or inter and intra-tribal politics. So what you had was, you could have tribes, and you very often did have 2 or 3 different tribes on the exact same place. Not only that, but you had tribes that were from the same lineage. So if we take the Quraysh, for example, you had many sub-tribes of the Quraysh, Banu Hashim, Lidar, Banu Makhzum, they were all part of that Quraysh kind of umbrella, right? And they had tensions and politics between them. That would not be racialized, because there was no difference. There was no different lineage. There was never any kind of like rationalization saying that there was different lineage. Everyone accepted that they were from the same lineage. And there was no rationalization to say there was some othering, right? In a scientific way or in any other culture. There was no like, you are worse than me because of this. You are worse than me. Do you know what I mean? There was none of that. It was just intra-politics, intra-tribal politics, right? So you had issues where, House and Khazraj, probably the most well-known, the most famous example to Muslims at least, where they had started off some row because of, if I'm wrong, it was somebody did something with someone else, or I can't remember now. But there was some very minor issue that had blown up over generations. It was based on that. It wasn't based on. So can you guys still hear me or not?
It's cutting out. It's still cutting out.
Do you want me to come back in again? Leave and come back in again?
Maybe. Are you using your phone audio or?
Yeah. You know what? Let me switch to a different audio. 1 second.
Okay.
And within Asabiyya, there's none of this rationalization of racialized difference. There was only kind of this politics of tensions, whatever it was, that someone listening to this, whatever have you, or we want to do this or we want to do that, and so on. So Asabiyya and racism, I wouldn't say that they are the same thing. It's almost, Asabiyya is almost a form of like proto-nationalism rather than racism, if that makes sense. Cool. Are there any other questions or comments on anything else?
Elaborate on the Asabiya, you mean, yeah?
Yeah.
On the on the nationalism, or on Asabiya as in general? Okay. So let's touch on the racialization first. So in order to have racialization, you have to create an otherness, right? So there has to be an otherness, and you have to ascribe a certain set of characteristics to the other and a certain set of characteristics to yourself. So as we kind of like saw, in presentation, I hope it came across that that can be done through many ways, two which are religious and scientific. So what you do is you say, we observe difference, right? Well, there is an observable difference. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and describe or understand why that is. And you say that person is not the same as me or my group. So my group is X and that group is Y, right? And that's what you have when you create race or species. Whereas Asabiya is more like nationalism. You're not in Asabiya. You're never ever saying, for instance, that they are other than me, right? They are different species entirely. They are a different race, right? As I said, in many cases, you had Asabiya within intra-tribal relationships. And so it's not possible to other in that case, it's not possible to have that kind of othering. So how do we understand that? It can't be racism. So it's more like nationalism, where nationalism is like, this is my group of culturally linked or socially linked people, right? You do get ethno-nationalism, but that's not the case here, because within the peninsula, or in the peninsula, you're really speaking mostly to people who are the same ethnicity, roughly, right? Or very closely linked ethnicities. But yeah, you have nationalism is is cultural or social or historic group that have some sort of commonality. So Asabi is more like that. Asabi is more like, well, we have a particular set of customs. We have a particular shared history, right? Me and my buddies here, we have a shared history, or we have a shared, culture, or we socialize together. You, on the other hand, you do not socialize with us, or you don't have that shared history that we have. So if that's the case, then you're not really part of our group. You may be part of the same racial group, but you're not part of our group. Now, if you think about that in terms of, say, for instance, the English and the French when they were at war, it would be kind of that sort of thing. The English are one group historically and culturally, and the French are one group historically and culturally. In the same way, when we have the Aus and the Khazraj, they are two groups that share the same ethnicity, quote unquote, but have different cultural and historic roots, right? Or different cultural and historic kind of like whatever it may be. So it's not a case that they're racializing one another. It's a case that they're kind of like almost proto-nationalizing one another. So the Aus is one nation, quote unquote, and the Khazraj is one nation, quote unquote. And because of that, because you can then say, well, your group of cultural, your cultural group or historic group has offended my cultural or historic group, and therefore we no longer wish to have any relationship with you, or we have an antagonistic relationship with you because of this history. So it's based more around that rather than based around racism, if that makes sense. Is that a bit clearer or not? Have I muddied the water even more?
Yeah, so that's why I kind of say you know, Asabiya is is not the same as racism. Like not even like you mean in terms of nationalist thinking? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have that kind of nationalist thinking today, definitely. It's just on a different level because now within the modern within the modern world. I guess an interesting question. Yeah, so in the modern world, you know, we have kind of states and boundaries and this sort of thing. So you can have multiple, for example, you can have multiple ethnic groups, like in Pakistan, you have multiple ethnic groups that are part of one nation. So it's slightly different. Whereas, you know, for example, the Aus and the Khazraj were kind of like one continuous ethnic group. You know, you can have nationalities now that are multiple ethnic groups, or even multiple cultural groups, right? I think of Britain. Britain, we have multiple cultural groups that are part of the British nationality, quote unquote. Um, so yeah, you definitely get that type of nationalist thinking today. You know, again, think of Pakistan and India, where one nation is antagonized or antagonizing the other because they have a different you know, national label because they have a different historical context or political context. So the other question about nationalism and modern phenomenon that was built from colonialism, yeah, it's there are definitely some kind of like colonial groups, but it's not so much colonial as it is um, European. So I'll explain that a little bit. So nationalism really started off as a European project. So nationalism was like, you know, we need to have a better kind of way of understanding and relating to one another. So we're French and you're German and you're this and you're that, right? Previous to that, you didn't really have those kind of hard and fast borders. It was just kind of like it was understood to be that's kind of Germany and this is kind of France and this is the area where they kind of meet together. And you know, you may have people who live in what we now would consider Germany that would relate more to France than you have people in south of Germany. You know, there's an interesting case where you know in Germany, because it's different states and you had to pass, you know, back in the day, you had to pass two different toll booths and so on and so forth. Within Germany, like it became really, really expensive to, you know, even ship a letter, deliver a letter, sorry, from one end of Germany to the other, much more so than it was to deliver a letter from, let's say, the south of France to the north of Germany, or the west of Germany, right? So this was kind of one of the impetuses for nationalizing and say, actually, we need to have a coherent understanding of who we are historically and culturally. But anyway, that's an aside. Yeah, so nationalism was a very European construct. The rest of the world didn't really think about it that way. You had your tribal group, your ethnic group, your, you know, really is how you formed. Then you had within that subsets of families. So when we look back at the time of Rasulullah, the Arabs were an ethnic group. And then underneath that, you had your tribal groupings. And then within those, you had subgroupings of tribes. And then within those, you had family groups. And that's generally kind of how societies function. But when the colonialists expanded across the world, they took nationalism with them and started to nationalize groups. So partition is a really interesting case of this. Actually, partition. What happened was you had Muslims, Hindus, predominantly you had Sikhs and some other groups as well, who previously to that were like okay with each other. So you had Hindus living in the north of India, for instance, which was a predominantly Muslim area at the time, and you had Muslims living in the Deccan, south of India, right? And they kind of did their own thing, and you know it was relatively peaceful. And it wasn't kind of like you didn't really have so much antagonism. And then you had what Indian historians call communalism, which happened after 57, the Sipahi rebellion. and that led to partition. And so when before partition, what happened was you had these politicians like Jinnah, Nehru, and so on saying, we represent a people. Well, who do you represent? Okay, well, Nehru, we represent Indians. Well, what does that mean? Who's Indian? So you're creating this construct now. You're creating this idea off the back of British, really, it was British census reports. So the British, when they kind of were administrating India, were like, well, we have India. And what does that mean? They split it down into demographics. We have Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and so on. And these are Indians, right? So off the back of that, Nehru was like, we represent these people because that's what we understand as an Indian nationality. And the Muslims are like, well, actually, no, we're not. So Jinnah was like, well, no, we're not Indian. We're separate to that. We want our own. We live in these regions and you live in these regions. So it was nationalism that was imported by British colonialists into India that really hardened these kind of ideas that you are a nation, you are a group of people for whatever reason. So to answer the question in short, nationalism started off as a European idea in Europe as a way to kind of organize their states, boundaries, and so on, and was then exported into the rest of the world. You see the same thing wherever colonialism took place. There are groups of people that were previous to the British arriving that were diverse, that were kind of discrete from one another. You can think of like South Africa. You have so many different, ethno-linguistic groups there that are now just South African. Same thing with like Nigeria. Nigeria has so many ethno-linguistic different groups. House of the Fulani and so on that are now just Nigerian. So yeah, it was exported to the rest of the world via colonialism. I hope that makes sense. Any other points or questions or anything? Give you guys a second to to think. I hope the session was interesting and was useful.
Definitely beneficial, genuinely appreciated.
Why are you talking? I can't hear you.
Well, just thanking you for the session. Just saying it was definitely a benefit. Alhamdulillah. Sorry,
but one second. For some reason, I can't hear you. I'm just gonna there we go. Try that.
I was just thanking you for the session. Is it any clearer now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, sorry, I don't know what's going on with my technology, but yeah, no, no problem. Hope it was useful.
So maybe you can go over what you plan to cover next session, inshallah, just a little bit.
Yeah. So this session was really about kind of establishing a baseline for defining racism, what racism is, and kind of where it came from. Hopefully we're kind of on the same page now with that. So the next session 2 is racism. How do we understand things like colorism or orientalism? How does racism manifest itself? So this was about defining racism, and next session is going to be about what are the different types of racisms that exist, and how are they deployed, and where, and so on. So it's again, racism is not one thing; it's a number of things, and it manifests differently within different thoughts, and it manifests differently in different regions. So that'll be the next session. Then session 3, global racisms. So that's going to be more about how, so like the concept of whiteness, for example, or blackness, for example, is not the same in from country to country. So you have people, for instance, that are considered white in India, let's say, that would be considered coloured in the UK, right? So how does that work, and how does that kind of figure itself out? Then CRT with fourth session. What is it, and what are its applications today? So CRT is an interesting thing. It's gotten a lot of bad press recently. What about, yeah? Well, I suppose, yeah, recently. And it's about demystifying what CRT is, and what its applications are, and how it's useful to us. And then finally, we'll touch on Islamophobia and how we understand Islamophobia as a problem of race rather than anything else. So that'll be the sessions, inshallah. If you guys want to sign up, and then I'll just yeah. So my email address for you guys, if said, we can continue these discussions, or if people want to have a reading list. As I said, I didn't provide a reading list because I didn't want it to be a prerequisite for these sessions. So, but if people want reading, you can email me, and my email address is there. I'll put it in the comments as well, just in case people can't see my screen. I don't know why that's not working. Okay, I'll you know what, I think Darius got my email address, so he can send it out to you guys if you guys register. We can carry on these discussions during the week if you like. But yeah, barakallahu feek, and jazakallah khair for.
So there's a question. There's a question. Is there only 5 sessions?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I missed that. Yeah. So it's the 5 sessions. So when me and Tariq were putting this together, I was like, at first I was like, let's do 10 sessions weekly, and then I realized that's almost 3 months, which I don't know if people have that commitment to kind of do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to do these 5 sessions, and then should anybody be interested in doing more sessions or delve deeper into any particular area or particular concept or idea, then what we can do is we can do that. Yeah, just let us know. Let me know. Let Tariq know if that's what you want to do, and we can do that. Happy to do that.
Awesome. Any other last questions or comments?
No, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Brother Nadeem and Brother Tariq, for organizing this as well. Yeah, it's been really informative, and yeah, inshallah, I can't wait to attend next time as well.
Inshallah. No worries. Barakallahu feek. No worries, inshallah. I think we can wrap it up here. We're past our 2 hours. And yeah, so if you haven't registered, please register through the link that I pasted on the chat. And inshallah, I will send the payment details. So through Australia, you can pay through bank transfer, and overseas we might try PayPal or a local UK account if you're in the UK, otherwise PayPal, inshallah. All right. Barakallahu feekum, everyone, and inshallah we'll end here and see you all next week at the same time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.